that you would have if you just went to, were hired off the street. And then for your existing employees, people like seeing young people succeed. It gives them a feeling that they made a difference in their job, and it changes the way they think about their company. So it increases the loyal and engaged employees within the company that's actually hosting the apprentices. And interestingly enough, it increases innovation. These young kids are digital natives. At Swisscom, 10% of their workforce of 8,000 employees are apprentices. And one of the reasons Swisscom does that is because they believe these young people bring innovation to their company. For the apprentice, the benefits are skills and expertise, debt-free college credit, valued industry credentials, and important for many of our kids that don't have an established professional network, working within an office environment for many is the difference between breaking out of poverty or not, because they need that network, and it provides that. And then certainly $30,000 over 3 years of the apprenticeship can be the difference maker for some kids, whether they stay in school or not. Benefits, impact. So from CareerWise's, what we're providing to make this all possible are in these categories. First is recruiting. You would have thought recruiting, or I did, recruiting would be the easiest thing we could do with our schools because they open the doors. What we learned though is starting at the top is important, but if you don't convince the teachers that this is a good opportunity for their students, then it doesn't go anywhere. So it took us a year or so to figure that out. We have a team that works with the schools, trains the counselors and the administrators on the program and why it's of value to their students. We develop training plans for the businesses as well as apprenticeship training. We're the education liaison both in K-12 and higher ed. And we provide employer training, which is critical to the success of the program, and then ongoing program support. In time, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, some of these supports won't be as critical because businesses will know how to do it. But initially, for the first probably 10, 20 years, it's going to be essential. The next thing I wanted to touch on is what we're calling our Equity First initiative. We began doing diversity, equity, and inclusion training a year ago. Over the last 6 months, with the advent of the murder of George Floyd and what's happened on the streets of this country, we asked ourselves at CareerWise, even though we think we're at the center of opportunity, can we do more? And what we determined is that for those employers that want to put a particular effort towards equity, and many do, they've been contacting us, we created our Equity First initiative, and I'll be transparent. This has been developed over the last 2 months in terms of the concept. We're now working with multiple employers, some that we approached, some that approached us, interested in ensuring that their talent is diverse. The CEO of Home Advisor, $1 billion company, called us. They're already training apprentices, but he said to me, I look across our company and what I see is a lot of white faces. This has got to change. We have to develop our talent and play a role. It isn't about writing checks, it's about actually doing something meaningful. So these are the headlines of the program that we're developing, both for the city of Denver, we're in development right now with them, as well as some of our employers that will be certified as Equity First employers, meaning that they're opening up their plant to, or their offices to additional training. How do you onboard a young person from a diverse background? What are the sensitivities that are important to make sure that they do feel welcome? And we'll build that model, pilot it this year, and then begin to scale it once we figured out what works and what doesn't, so that we ensure the best outcomes for our young people. Next slide. So we've made significant progress over the last 4 years. Certainly this year and the pandemic has impacted us, but interestingly enough, where interns were being laid off in other programs, over 68% to 70% of our apprentices stayed on the job, either working remotely or if they were working for an essential business on site, meaning that they truly were an integral part of that business. So you can see from 2017 when we started, we will send this PowerPoint out so you can see the growth in communities, schools, higher ed partners that we've been working with. Our intent was to pilot for 4 years and then work to scale our program. I will tell you, this is a very complex model. When you look under the hood of what I've described, there's a lot going on. And we've learned a lot over the last 4 years. And we believe enough as we move into our 5th year to begin to scale. Any questions about this growth trend? So the next slide here is really where our growth is. And in partnership with Brent and Paya, there's substantial interest in this work. And the dark blue states have visited Colorado to learn in our summit what it is we do, what our learnings have been. And then we've launched CareerWise New York, as I'm sure you're aware. And it was interesting, when we started, it happened earlier, but after working with Jamie Dimon and the business council that he had set up, and his commitment to making something like this work, we were able to, in partnership with Here to Here, create CareerWise New York. What we learned is, by sharing our knowledge, our technology platform, our competency sets, they were able to start up and launch at 10% of what it cost us to build all that product and do it with high quality. And I just saw a week ago their next class coming in, even in the middle of a pandemic, with significant numbers of companies like JP Morgan Chase, Amazon, and other brand name companies who it's important to note, enterprise level companies can't have 50 different ways to operate this type of program across this country. If they do, they just won't do it. It will become 50 different initiatives. What they're looking for is this kind of a standardization of how you can do this effectively. So what works in New York City could work in Denver, Colorado, in Texas, in Indiana. So between CareerWise DC in partnership with CityBridge, Elkhart, CareerWise Elkhart, we're now also working and providing support to Indianapolis. There's great interest in this, and as a collective, creating a community of practice of communities, cities, states that are wanting to scale this, I think we can really, over the next decade, fundamentally change outcomes for our country's young people and for our businesses. If we're going to compete globally, we need this type of education system. What we have today isn't checking all the boxes. So what CareerWise is doing, and I would call this our efficiencies created through our network, is what I explained happened in New York. From apprenticeship design, communications and marketing, we share out all of our video content. Everything that it takes to run a program doesn't have to be created from scratch. For some of our communities, actually all of our current communities, we just won a grant from the US Department of Labor, which is helping to scale registered apprenticeships in each of our partner communities. So we're working with all of our partners on all of these areas, from the advising that Ryan does so capably, as well as his team, so that communities don't have to make the same mistakes that we did, and that ultimately, as we learn from them, as Ryan said, we're now using the competency sets that came up from JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America and other banks in New York, because they were more cutting edge than what we had. So we're creating a community of practice. We're providing these supports, both our technology platform, which is seminal to this, our apprenticeship portal. When you start trying to onboard 1,000 students who want to enter into the portal and then connect them with hundreds of employers, you don't want to do that on a spreadsheet. So we built technology to do that, a performance management system, and all of that in a database using Salesforce, so that we can learn in terms of outcomes about the work that we're doing and the impact that we're having, so we can be in a cadence of continuous improvement. Next slide. So I'll leave you with one story, of which there are hundreds now in Colorado. We were at Pinnacle Assurance with over 30 of their apprentices, and I asked one of them, Angenique, how she viewed her future before her apprenticeship. And she thought for a minute, and she said, to be honest, I didn't think I had one. She was in an online learning course in Aurora Public Schools, teetering on whether or not she should stay in school. And what she said is, what I've learned is there's a place for me at Pinnacle. that I'm contributing to their success. And in turn, they're giving me an opportunity that I could not have imagined. She was in our first cohort. She is working on her associate's degree, and she was hired full-time by Pinnacle Assurance at a wage in excess of $45,000. That's the power of apprenticeship in the story of one. But what I will tell you, there are hundreds just like her. And if we as a city, as a country, think about how industry can and should play a role, I think we can change the outcomes for so many. And in the words of Jamie Dimon, when he was out here in April of this year, he was speaking to over 250 members of his customers from Private Client Bank. He said to them, if each of us would do what Pinnacle did, with over 5% of our workforce as youth apprenticeship, we would change this country. And he said to JP Morgan Chase, that's 10,000. We believe in this. We have the examples that would prove that it actually works. The question for all of us in your community and ours is, how do we make this real? How do we do the hard work that will change lives and I think fundamentally change our country? So with that, I'll pause and happy to answer questions.
No. This is Will Carestis with the school district here in Buffalo. Thank you, Noel, for that presentation. So this is a question for either Noel or Ryan. In the ideal, established, successful implementation of the model, could you, and you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but could you just briefly touch on what are the expectations of the local school district with regard to supporting this work?
I'll take a crack on that, and then Ryan, please add in where I leave off.
And can I add an addendum to that? Could you also share who were the first districts? What were the characteristics of those first districts you partnered with when you first piloted the work in Colorado?
So I'll start there. We started with Denver Public Schools, largest inner city district in our state with 90,000 students. And then we also picked Cherry Creek schools. And Cherry Creek schools were viewed as the highest performing large school district in the state. And it was strategic because we wanted to make the point that this was actually for all kids, not some kids. And if it had the validation of Cherry Creek, as well as obviously the participation where the majority of our apprentices come from at Denver, excuse me, the narrative begins to change about what apprenticeship is and the opportunity it can provide. In terms of what we expect from our partners or what we like to see from our partners ranges, and I'll use Denver as the example because they've done a phenomenal job. They actually passed a bill to raise $7.5 million a year in perpetuity to support career-connected learning. They made a commitment to do career exploration in middle school and have been ramping that up. So recognizing that career exploration, giving kids an understanding what opportunity might look like starting earlier is key. Third, that they work with us to help allow us to educate their teachers and their counselors on what this opportunity looks like, that it's not a dead end, that it in fact is an options multiplier, that they then give us access to their students to recruit from. And I mentioned our technology. We have a apprenticeship portal, which is where students enter into to post their resume and then apply to positions at various host companies. The schools approve that student before they're actually released into the portal, so that it validates that the student is on track to graduate. And so they have an integral role. Data sharing for many of our districts have different thresholds is critical because if we can't connect with the students, we can't really make the program work. So we work with them to educate their counselors, their teachers, and then the students. And then, obviously, these students need to graduate from high school, and they do in the same timelines, to make sure that their scheduling is done in a way that it allows them to do the apprenticeship, leaving school 2 days a week and then 3 days a week in their senior year, and still earn all of their high school credit. I thought that would be our biggest obstacle. But Susanna Cordova, who at the time was the head of curriculum at Denver Public Schools, she was on that first trip we took. And she said, I can do this. And she did. And now so has 17 school districts across the state. So scheduling is a big issue. Some school districts do same course structure throughout the district. Some are individualized by school. So it can get very complex, but having their commitment to do that scheduling, allow the student to get off, to ensure that they get credit for the time spent in the apprenticeship, are all key asks that we make of the school districts, and they've been amazingly supportive. Ryan, is there anything I left out?
Yeah, I think to Will's other part of the ideal state and the kind of future state of this, there's I think a world where more of the foundational CTE courses are more accessible and available across the board and are closer tied to the work that's actually done by apprentices. That's why that consistent competency set is so essential. If every employer is having their students do completely different things, and there's no way for schools to find out what's actually being trained to or what's necessary on a more real-time basis and more industry-wide, not just the one friend of the former CT instructor who used to work in the industry. That's an essential component to all of this. Right now, a lot of employers are taking on some pretty kind of green apprentices and doing some very foundational training that really should be in better partnership with K-12. But there's a sequencing and a scaling challenge with that.
Let me touch on some of the questions in the chat. First one is, can we elaborate on the funding model? So ultimately, our model is designed to be self-sustaining. So all of our companies pay a per apprentice fee of $2,000 per apprentice per year for the support that CareerWise provides, the competency sets, the training platforms, all of that work. And at scale, that should cover the majority of our work. In addition to that, obviously, they're also investing $10,000 on average per apprentice per year. So when you look even from year one, they've been spending millions of dollars to support the training development of this future workforce. And because of the retention rate of employers, they must be getting returned because they keep growing their cohorts and staying engaged. That being said, we're not sustainable today. So we have been very fortunate to have real support from some of our nation's largest philanthropies, whether it's Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and many others that are helping to build our infrastructure so that we can do what we're doing with other communities, sharing out our learning to reduce their costs, to build a technology platform that is now being used in all of our partner states. So it's more effective. So philanthropy is helping to invest in that. And they're doing the same for some of our partners, but their investment doesn't have to be at the same level as what it is at CareerWise. Long term though, as I think it exists in Switzerland, the majority of this cost will be paid for by industry as they're currently doing. But we need thousands of employers to really fill that bucket of resources to make this sustainable over time. The only exception, and this is new, is around our Equity First initiative. Some of those students will require additional supports to even the playing field, whether it be academic support, transportation support, that we don't want to transfer to the employer because then that ROI curve goes upside down. So I do see a role for philanthropy ongoing. WIOA funds at some point might be appropriate for those types of supports. So I think in perpetuity, the majority in the long term will be paid for by industry. Our Equity First initiatives will probably be paid for by either philanthropy or government.
Hey, Noel, I'm going to jump in. We had a question earlier about out-of-school youth from Laura Smith from the Buffalo Niagara Partnership. And specifically, how do you all, have you worked with community-based organizations to serve youth beyond those who are starting the program while they're still in high school? So thoughts on that. And just share for a minute as well how you have collaborated with community-based organizations, for example, in Denver in this work.
Well, in terms of out-of-school youth, let me start with that. Clearly, that's one of the more challenging communities because they're disconnected from school. It's hard to find them, and many of the issues that they're dealing with that led them to that place are more dramatic. We do have a pilot in Grand Junction with their workforce center and with the school district, specifically around out-of-school youth. And we're partnering with the workforce center that is in those students, subsidizing their initial wages for the first, I believe it's 6 months of their training and development within the business. And then when they get hired, obviously that becomes full responsibility of the company. They're getting great success with that. And what we're going to be doing in this pilot year is connecting those students to the formal apprenticeship. So the pre-apprenticeship will be what is currently handled by the Workforce Center and paid for by them. And then when they go into the formal apprenticeship, all of our other supports will kick in. We're also working with the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, which has an Opportunity Youth Initiative. We're in discussion right now on how to augment what they're doing. Part of that is by sharing our competency sets, our training models, both for our supervisors and the apprentices, to help strengthen their model. It's a very complex challenge working with out-of-school youth, but not one that I believe can't be met, at least in part by it. I will say, though, we didn't focus on that initially because the complexity of it, and obviously we have to get this off the ground and working, but we are beginning to work in those two ways. In terms of organizations that we're working with in the Equity First Initiative, we'll be working with other youth-serving organizations that provide wraparound services, and we're just beginning to develop those relationships now. In terms, so did I answer that question for you, Brent?
Laura gave us a thumbs up. That's good enough for me.
Let's see.
I got another question here. I'll help you out in kind of moderating these, Noel. From Kate about describing the role of higher education in this. So if you could talk a little bit about how you work with institutions of higher education in the training model, and specifically, when do they come into play in this work?
So in Colorado, we have a robust concurrent enrollment model within the high schools. So we're working with some of our apprentices on getting through concurrent enrollment, post-secondary learning, typically through the community college, where they would be taking career-related courses while they're in the apprenticeship in the 11th to 12th grade. What we found is that for many students, just keeping up with their schoolwork and the apprenticeship in the first 2 years is what most can handle, just that. There are a few unique students that can do all three. And so our work with the universities is becoming more and more relevant now as our apprentices are graduating, going on, or taking courses through concurrent enrollment. The long-term view is what I spoke about in terms of the legislation that passed this year to build that much more formally into our system. So whether you're an apprentice or an adult, you can get credit for prior learning. One of our local universities, Metro State University, we've been in talks with them to certify specific counselors or career advisors within the university to help coordinate the schedule and course load for a student that is continuing their apprenticeship while going to school. So we're working on a host of strategies with higher ed. One, to ensure that students can get credit. Two, that if they are going to college at the same time continuing with their apprenticeship, that they're scheduling around that for that student, as well as making sure that the course alignment is there for the business. Because at Intertech, I want to make sure not that all of their courses are related to our industry, but there is course alignment.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, one of the things that we've been really keen on, particularly in our model as a statewide initiative, is that not every course is available to every student in every region. And not every student is ready for every course. And so we've really tried to right-size the related instruction model for how we do this by creating ultimate flexibility. It really becomes a conversation between the apprentice and the employer. We provide course catalogs that represent training from higher education institutions and also third-party non-accredited training institutions that are industry-driven for the region that are available. And employers and apprentices self-assess as they're going through their competency rubrics and kind of training, and pull in those courses as they become relevant and necessary. One of the initiatives that we're hoping to push further on as we get into more of our policy work with higher education in Colorado is to make courses more available and more timely so that they can be accessed when needed. We had a situation where one of our apprentices is an auditing apprentice for an insurance firm and was needing to take their second level accounting course, wanted to take their second level accounting course, but first had to finish an either atmospheric science or astronomy course in order to access it. Those are the kind of things that we need to start changing so that we can create that more targeted course structure.
Thanks for that. Kate, does that get at your question? I'll go with thumbs up. I won't botch anyone's question anymore. Kristen, why don't you share what you want to dig a little deeper in on the education side?
Sure, thank you. I saw one of your slides that you had education and future educator listed as one of your apprentices. Now, this is typically a career that has some very specific higher ed requirements with bachelor's, master's degrees, teacher certifications. So can you please share what kind of careers within the education field you are, placing apprentices in, or kind of what their career trajectory looks like, knowing that there are those kinds of educational requirements for that field?
Sure. So we're piloting this now in 2 school districts, Denver and Cherry Creek. In Colorado, and I think this exists across the country, we have over a shortage of 3,000 teachers across our state, and with predominance in rural Colorado. So to your point, there are credentialing requirements. So the way it is currently in our pilot is the apprentice starts in the 11th grade as a paraprofessional in a paid position within the district. And they get the hands-on experience in the classroom in the same cadence that I described earlier. They're also, Cherry Creek developed a partnership with CU Denver to get supplemental training outside of the classroom that would be part of that ongoing training. And then upon graduation after their senior year, they'll leave Cherry Creek to go on to get their teacher credential at a university. But they'll leave in Cherry Creek with a letter that says, upon your successful completion of your degree program, you have a job in Cherry Creek. And part of Scott Siegfried, who's a superintendent, when we first sat down to talk about this 2 years ago, is he said, we have a problem in this district. Our teacher corps doesn't look like our student body. That needs to change. If we can use apprenticeship to begin to bring in young people that reflect our student body, we'll be a much better district. So they're using this as an equity strategy in addition to filling needed positions. And Denver is essentially developing a similar model. We're seeing how they work and how it transitions. Obviously, this is a long pipeline. So we're not asking to waive the academic requirements for the teachers, but we're letting those students decide early on, is teaching really what I want to do? Giving them that classroom time so that they can then move forward. And then Cherry Creek has agreed to register those teacher apprenticeships. So all of the apprenticeships will be registered going forward with the U.S.
The other exciting thing about that model, we know, at least I guess maybe this is more personal opinion, but teachers are underpaid in this country and certainly in Colorado, and it doesn't wind up being the most lucrative career. So it's really important to be able to try to make that as financially lucrative as possible for our students. And by starting earlier, they're actually entering into the state pension system when they're in 11th grade. So they're actually getting an earlier get on their retirement funds. And so that's a huge value to these young people that might have had to wait until after they've already incurred so much debt before they ever even get to step foot in there. So that's another exciting part of this.
Levi, I see you off mute.
Oh, well, thanks, Brent. Yeah, I put a question in and I've actually this has been really great and unbelievable download on what you've been doing, and kudos on what you've done with CareerWise everywhere. I have a couple questions, but one of them was how or if we can leverage what's already existing in New York State as we think about getting this going in Western New York. And I guess there's a policy question embedded in there, whether there's something larger that we can or should be doing. That's one of my questions. And I have one other kind of systemic question.
Well, first, I would say with an emphatic yes.
Okay.
I love the New York team. They're amazing people. Obviously, developing an apprenticeship program within the city is different than certainly it is in Colorado. And it's important to note our belief at CareerWise, we would never go in ourselves and say, we're going to establish a CareerWise office and initiative by ourselves. These need to be community-based. And so that's important. And the fact that you're coming together as a community to say, is this right for us, is important. We're here to support that to the extent you want that. As far as New York goes, they're moving at a really good pace. And I know that they would love to share with any community, particularly one within New York. I know that Washington, D.C., our Washington affiliate, has visited a couple times to learn more about their program. With that, Ryan, I'll turn it over to you if you add any more context, because Ryan really works with them on a daily, weekly basis, as well as his team.
Yeah, I think, Levi, to your point, there's a variety of benefits or opportunities to take advantage of in that. From an efficiencies perspective, leveraging the technology platform that they're building, leveraging the marketing collateral that's New York centric, thinking about the competency sets, and even cross-business pollination, right? As there's businesses that have operations in both cities, are all ways to partner with them and think about how this works. I think the other really incredible value that I know that they're excited about as Buffalo starts to build and Western New York starts to build out their own youth apprenticeship system, with or without CareerWise at the table, either way, going to Albany together and advocating for the kind of the same agenda is going to be so much more powerful than any one community trying to do this on their own. Because ultimately, New York does have some state legislation that is going to have to change in order to scale this. Megan, you mentioned a role for Department of Labor in this, and I think there's a lot on the youth labor law side. Certainly, we're not trying to create opportunities to take advantage of young people or put the power out of balance between employers and employees. But at the same time, when there's legislation that states that a young person in school cannot work more than 4 hours in a day that precedes a school day, that makes it a problem if businesses are looking to work with a school on a block schedule and would like the student to work on B days while the student is in classes on A days. You right now cannot do that in New York. So New York City and the New York team has had to figure out the workarounds in that, which is another value. You get to learn from their lessons as it relates to your local policy, but it also gives you that partner and advocacy, which I think is a really powerful and exciting thing.
Noel, clearly the ColoradoWise has benefited greatly from your vision, your lived experience, your civic leadership. You are the business leader who has championed this. That becomes very clear in your presentation. And so, two-part question: do you have a counterpart in New York, in New York City, that is championing this business leader who is the spokesperson, the visionary, the leader, the champion? And how important is it to have that position filled?
So in New York, certainly Jamie Dimon is the kind of advocate you want, and he is. He's spoken about apprenticeship, at CNBC's, on the news stations and so forth. So we supported the delegation, but he led a delegation of business leaders to Switzerland last year that Ryan helped orchestrate. So it does help a lot to have business leadership. And I think it also sends a message that business has a responsibility that we didn't know we were ignoring, but we are. And when you have a business leader say, hey, this makes my business, I think it's incredibly valuable. I also don't think that it is the only way. Elkhart is an example where it is HEA in Elkhart, which is the nonprofit that is hosting CareerWise New York. It doesn't, they have a board of directors, but it's a professionally driven intermediary without specific somebody in my role. They have a board of directors, and certainly the chair of their board is a business person, I believe, still is. I met one a year ago. I don't think that's turned over. So I think there's different models, but I think having business leadership is important and advantageous, but I wouldn't say don't do it without that. But I would, in all honesty, say if you don't have business getting behind this, it's a really impossible lift. I mean, it's tough.
Got a couple more quick things I want to touch on in the chat, the remaining time we have. Megan, we touched on a little bit of the State Department of Labor from the New York context, but Noel, Ryan, I think it's important to say a few words about how you have worked with the State Department of Labor in Colorado and Joe Barella, who's the commissioner there. I will say that the key thing is in New York, you have a state apprenticeship council, you register programs at the state level. Colorado, you do that federally, gives you some, I'll say, a little bit more flexibilities. Could you talk a little bit for a quick few moments about how you have worked with the Department of Labor, but also, are looking at registration, particularly through the new DOL money?
So we work very closely. As I mentioned earlier, I co-chair with the executive director, Joe Barella, of the Department of Labor. They've developed an office within the Colorado Workforce Development Council just on apprenticeship. It's not an apprenticeship office in the way that you were describing it in New York. But they're a connector, they're a facilitator of this. We work through workforce centers, either directly with them or referred by them. So they're an important player in this effort. They don't drive it specifically, it still is driven by CareerWise and the partnership that they're a part of through the Bell Commission. But in terms of who we ultimately staffed my co-chair with through the Bell Commission, we purposely picked the Department of Labor. I think it was a good choice, and that relationship continues to grow.
As it relates to registration at the state level in New York, obviously there's a uniqueness there for you all. And what the CareerWise New York team is doing right now is working with NISDOL on registering the same competency sets that we have here in Colorado and that have registered with USDOL, but converting those to the kind of framework that NISDOL likes to see and register them as competency-based apprenticeships. So that work's starting now. They're trying to push through, I believe, 15 youth occupations to register with those competencies now so that they can have a good bucket to work with as they enter into their 2-year probationary period where they can't register an additional set of competencies.
Great. Thank you. I have one more question I want to kick to here. We'll probably have to close it out for the moment there to just move into the wrap up. Questions from Kate again. Kate, do you want to share what you want to touch on around wraparound services?
Sure. You mentioned that there are wraparound services associated with your program in Colorado, and I was wondering about a specific group, and that is youth that become parents when they're in high school that have really specific and deep needs in order to work through any program. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with that group, and have you developed any wraparound services or programs to allow them to navigate into the pathway program?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay. To my knowledge, and Noel, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't worked directly in Colorado all that much lately, but to my knowledge, we've had 3 apprentices that are parenting so far. And the way Denver County's workforce system it works is they outsource a lot of the supportive services and supports that they use, particularly for WIOA. And so Denver Public Schools is in fact the actual contractor for the workforce system's WIOA funds as it relates to some of those youth services, particularly for parenting youth. And so DPS is already at the table in that work with us, finding daycare opportunities or funding for such things. Additionally, there's a mental capacity consideration and wanting to provide the right supports. So one of the things that we do as an intermediary is provide that case management, that coaching and mentoring through our customer success managers. So they're working with both the employer and the student directly, and as well as coordinating with the student's counselor, parents if they're available, and other resources to kind of create a community-based approach that's fairly unique to each student's needs. I will say that it sounds all smooth as I just described it, but there's a lot of considerations around co-enrollment or whether or not they're able to be enrolled at that time, whether or not the timing works out, and whether or not the funds are available. So I think in each case, there's been a little bit of a different scenario and how it actually plays out. And I can't confirm that any of the three have actually completed their apprenticeships yet, and I believe at least one have dropped out of the apprenticeship, because I know it's an incredible toll. So any ideas you have or ways that you've handled that with other work-based learning programs, we'd be very interested in learning.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the last question, but have it build off Dave's that he just popped in. What advice do you have for this group of partners here in Western New York and Buffalo of where to start if in moving ahead with these things? What do you wish you knew going in? And I think Dave's hitting on one of the critical questions, which is how fast is too fast, but how big, how wide, and how many occupations you go first is too many. So feel free to do whatever you want, but if you want to touch on Dave's question, that won't be the last time we ask you that, I bet.
I'm glad I didn't know when I started what I know now. And I say that half jokingly. Being the first out means you're on the bleeding edge of this and you're creating something from nothing. And that certainly was challenging. At the same time, I'm so glad we did this. I do believe that where you start is with business and engagement with them so that they understand their role and their importance and how it benefits them. Not just from building good community, because so many companies want to do that, but equally and probably more so that this is good for your business and your ability to compete. So I start with business and just based on our own experience. Second, obviously identifying who those first education partners are, where the superintendent is interested and willing to participate. My experience has been, I haven't found one that wasn't. What they are frustrated about tends to be business shows up for a few months, gets bored, and loses interest. This is a long-term commitment. It's a workforce solution. So you start with business, you extend that obviously to the schools, K-12 first, but at the same time, and we did it concurrently, you build your partnerships with higher ed so that you're not viewed as a threat, but recognize the value that each one of those constituencies play in the success of your program. So I think I would start in those areas. I would learn, as we had to go thousands of miles away to learn what this could look like at scale. I do believe still in the value of bringing key leadership to see this in scale, whether that would be to Colorado, New York, or Switzerland. Seeing something is believing. Seeing something at scale was frankly key to this. There were people that got on that plane leaving from Denver, those 48 leaders, not knowing whether or not this was right for Colorado. The first day they didn't know it was right. By the end of the day, they all made commitments. So seeing and understanding is important. The good news, we now have multiple communities across the country. I think letting leadership see that, people like yourselves, and some of you already have, getting a deep understanding of it is another important element of that. And then, you know, organizations like ours and PAIA are there to support what's necessary. I'm not big on reinventing the wheel. I'm big on improving it. And we've looked at CareerWise is what can we learn from other communities as we're building our model, and then what can we learn together. So that would be my answer to that. I don't know, Ryan, if you would add something as well.
I think just more specifically to Dave's question in the chat, I think there's definitely too broad and too fast, right? And one of the things that one of the ways in which you can push on the system levers that you need to change and the cultural levels you need to change is to get a higher percentage of participation in a very specific place. So working within a specific school to get a higher penetration rate, to get a higher cohort number, so that you're actually starting to look at feasibly being able to change master schedules and not just doing one-offs for 5 students that happen to be participating in this little side activity. And you have enough employers participating in the sector so that they're building something robust that is actually going to be able to make those suggestions to how curriculum gets developed for related instruction. And they can influence each other and create some competition with each other on who trains the best apprentices. That's important. If you have a bunch of one-offs because you went really broad, you're not going to gain those efficiencies, you're not going to gain those learnings, and it's going to take a lot longer to affect those kind of cultural and systemic changes.
And I would add, you know, we've seen communities start off with 5 or 10. I would tell you that's too small. I think going much further than 100 is probably too large because of the complexities involved. And if you put it through the filter that Ryan just described, I think you have a high chance of success. You know, when we were in Switzerland, and Ryan probably remembers this, I suggested to Ursula Reynolds, who was their Secretary of Education and who built or really modernized their system, that in Colorado we could be at 3,000 in a couple of years. And she, like right in the middle of class, pointed her finger right at me and said, and you will fail, because she knew how complex this is. So don't start too small, but go slow to go fast. Set realistic expectations, stretch expectations, and move fast. You know, as we are 4 years into this, and this takes time. People can't expect this work to happen overnight. So go in with appropriate expectations that this is about system change, which leads to lives changing, which leads to businesses being more successful. This makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't happen fast. Depend on those around you, whether it's in New York, supports that we can provide. So learn from us, learn from other communities around the country, which PAIA is helping to facilitate, so that you can move faster than we did.
Well, with that, I want to thank you all. I know how hard it is to get the 2 of you in one place at the same time, or even virtually, and for 90 minutes. So I want to thank you for your time and always thoughtful perspectives and advice, and for sharing the story. I couldn't think of a better way to kick off our learning process. So with that, a virtual applause to you all, and thank you. I'm going to ask our advisory committee to stick around, but thank you, Ryan and Noel, and have a great rest of the morning out west.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thanks for having us.
you.
Hey, we just put the PDF of the deck in the chat, so you can download that there.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll be asking for more, I bet.
Bye-bye.
See you, Noel. Thank you. All right. Thank you all. Thank you for the very thoughtful questions. I want to go ahead. I don't want to take another whole 30 minutes if I don't have to here, get us out here a little bit early. But first things first, I just wanted to create a little space for any quick reactions. I've got a few questions here. Don't feel like you have to answer these, but would be very interested in people's initial thoughts on what you thought was compelling about what you heard about our first kind of deep dive case into the CareerWise Colorado model, which is a model out there in the US, and what you generally thought was relevant or even not relevant to the Western New York experience. But or any big questions you still have? Anybody have initial thoughts they want to throw out on the table?
Just for a point of clarification, Brent, what is the relationship between CareerWise and PIA? It sounds like you're both doing the same thing and informing each other as you go.
So PIA is a national initiative that has multiple place-based partners. CareerWise is one of them. Charleston Regional Apprenticeships in South Carolina is another. We fund them as well as other partnerships across the country. We did not fund them through our grant initiative. We funded them as a national partner because they are among the few sites that is providing technical assistance to other communities across the country. So they work with us on strategy. We're an agnostic broker of communities that, who want to work with various sites, including CareerWise. But they've been a great partner to us in setting up CareerWise and vice versa. We provided advice and thoughts to them as their programs expand.
So both of you provide technical assistance. They're also, CareerWise USA is their national replication approach.
Correct. They go much deeper with the communities they partner with than we do in terms of they provide, as they mentioned, there's a few areas, and I've got it down here on this bottom slide. They provide their branded templates for the pathways that they've developed with industry partners. They have training materials. They have a technology platform. That is a very specific type of partnership that, again, we're agnostic of sites we fund, sites we work with. If they want to go deeper and work with CareerWise, there's certainly precedent for that, and we can help with that. They certainly have a vision for, I'll put it this way, as a trade-off for places that want to move fast and quick. They have kind of that quick start kit in a way that is specific to kind of their approach. Good question. Other quick thoughts or reactions or clarifications?
Maybe it's hi Brent, this is Dave. I'm curious what our employers think. Ultimately, I liked how they framed this around the value add. I think there's a clear racial equity component to this. There's a clear component to this. There's a clear workforce component to this, in particular in the city where we've left talent on the sidelines for a long time, in my opinion. But it has to have a positive return too. So I was real happy to hear about the ROI that they've seen across the state in Colorado. But I'm, again, curious what our employers think after hearing that, because ultimately, I think that is one of the most important users we'll have in this work group.
Dave, I'm sorry.
You can go.
This is Mike Keating speaking on behalf of Wegmans. I think what Michelle and I just heard was very well done, very realistic. We have been working on this vision and mission for a couple decades now, without necessarily a framework or a partner that could help us scale it to the degree that we would like to. I surprised to see the industry segments that were kind of carved out there, and I just want to make an early pitch for the industry segment that is a bit of the Rodney Dangerfield of industry segments, and that's food retailing. I think based on the composition of Western New York in terms of the food retailers that are here, and wanting to kind of clarify the economic opportunity for young people in our industry. We've got a number of pathways and career tracks that we have done a better job documenting of late to try to demystify our industry. We have artisan career tracks that could lead to somebody being a cheese maker or a seafood monger or a baker, where these folks will earn up to $55,000, $60,000. We have culinary career tracks where you can make in the neighborhood of $120,000. We have leadership tracks that ultimately could lead to store management, making north of $200,000. And I just think that the model that was put out there, you know, all of the points that were made are very, very realistic, particularly where we already employ these young people, but have failed to help them understand the vision and the pathway and the potential for them to make a very lucrative living and provide for their families in a very meaningful way. Michelle and I are just particularly excited to be invited to be part of this, and would like to make a pitch early on that our industry be included.
I think just to build upon that, I think from a manufacturing perspective, so Riches has done apprenticeship programs across the US in different sites, and some partner directly with high schools on this work. It sometimes is extremely challenging to facilitate that directly with schools and try and make that something that is beneficial to the business and then also beneficial to the student. So I think it was really nice to hear how they have done. They are kind of the go-between between those relationships, because I think from a corporate perspective, trying to do that on your own is pretty challenging. I think there's a lot of different ways that something like this could potentially work in Western New York, as long as the right industries and then set roles were targeted.
Other reactions from folks?
I would just comment that was really impressive, and that the fact what they've done in 4 years, this seems replicable and adaptable to our community and eminently doable, and I think more important than ever, given the current context of multiple pandemics at once, both health, economy, and race. So it was great. I think Clotilde an earlier point about business leadership championing that, and I think we have that here in Western New York ready to go as well. So it was interesting to hear from industry and business leaders that have done this, and I thank you guys for arranging it. Really helpful.
Yeah, I would add that I think, you know, we have a lot to learn, I think, about what's happening in CareerWise in New York City and what are the particular challenges policy-wise that they, you know, are tackling, have tackled, right? So that we know, you know, kind of what we might, what is already sort of the road has been paved and what part is still bumpy. And I really like the point of being able to advocate together in Albany if we're serious about this. So I think really trying to get closer to what's happening there is going to be important in this as part of this learning phase of our work.
I can echo everything I'm hearing. This is Will from the school district. We're excited to be a part of this, you know, this ongoing discussion. There's so much promise in anything that is going to strengthen the bond between the corporate center, the civic leadership in our community, and the schools. So we're definitely excited to be a part of this discussion, and you can count on us to contribute in any way we can to a full and robust, you know, review of how to make a collaboration like this work.
I just wanted to comment on Susan's piece around, we are actually submitting some recommendations to the governor's office on Monday, and it includes some policy review around youth apprenticeship. I will share it out to the group so you can see the larger document of all the recommendations around workforce, but there is a specific piece around bringing clarity around how to work. That was why my question was in Colorado. I wanted to address the fact that we have those barriers here, and having these employers on this call today and our educators behind the decision to streamline the opportunities for youth apprenticeship is going to be really, really helpful.
It's great to hear, Megan. And I think that streamline's the right word. That's generally what we find from a policy standpoint, is that, you know, it's how you can make this work easier to happen amongst the other partners without having to do workarounds and whatnot. That sounds great. If you'd like to circulate that, happy to get that out to the whole group. A couple things I'll just point out, because again, this was a first deep dive. You will hear from some folks from some other places as well. Things that stand out about CareerWise that just are important to kind of keep in your head. It is what we kind of call a very concentrated intermediary model. CareerWise is a nonprofit organization that concentrates a lot of the functions of making a youth apprenticeship program work, from building the programs, recruiting the students, recruiting the employers, and then supporting the success of folks through the program. And there's a lot of upsides to that in terms of a central point of accountability. You'll hear from some different approaches to that that are a little bit more distributed kind of partnership models. But that's one I want to make sure is clear. And it's one that, again, the more you concentrate things, the more costly it is to start those functions up and house them in one place. But it's certainly something as we learn to keep in mind in terms of both what are the advantages and disadvantages of that approach. The second thing I'll point out is that they have a pretty standardized approach, which is not unfamiliar in our apprenticeship in the United States, but they are a really strong example of these multi-employer apprenticeship models, where traditionally in the United States, it's kind of been, we build these programs one employer at a time. What they have done is created these standardized competencies and skills across each of their verticals, whether that's manufacturing, financial services, IT, and the employers kind of use those. And there's some real advantages to having that consistency, both for the student and the employer. CareerWise creates them and lets any community that use their standards, that partners with them and that can build off and use those. And there's particularly a lot of advantages if you're doing, for example, the same types of pathways they're doing in New York City, creating portability by training to sort of similar industry competencies. But what you will see is that in some cases, intermediaries will work in other places with employers to kind of build these more customized approaches. That's it. I want to make sure we have the opportunity to kind of discuss what the pros of really the strength of a multi-employer approach is, again, for the student as well as the employer. The third piece is one Clotilde rightfully kind of drove at them at around sort of their funding model. Because they are a nonprofit organization, they kind of sit at the intersection of employers and education. They did require some philanthropic seed funding to start up their capacity, but their sustainability model is one that is built off employer fees. And they do that per apprentice. They use some of those resources to fund things like prior learning assessments and make sure that students are getting credentials and credit. We will dig more into the sort of financing model and how that works, but I want to make sure that's kind of sticking with folks in their head. Any other final questions or reflections about today?
Brent, this is Blythe. I'd like to ask a question about the difference between the concentrated intermediary model that we heard about and a more distributed model. It seems to me that so much of this in some ways is creating a different culture. This is not the culture of this country. It's not the culture of, any of the sectors that are involved here. And that was very compelling. And so the idea of the intermediary model, which is so kind of does the hand holding to support every type of partner that makes this work, seems to be necessary if we're going to shift culture. And so I'm just wondering if it takes longer in a more distributed model for that to actually happen.
Good question, Blythe. And what I will say is that there always has to be a center point of accountability, whether it's sort of concentrated or more distributed. At the same time, it's what we will be doing is mapping what the functions are of an intermediary. There are instances where intermediaries rely more on their K-12 partners on the recruitment as opposed to running kind of the recruitment of apprentices themselves. There are models where intermediaries rely more on, for example, their business community to kind of develop shared competencies as opposed to convening those processes alone. There always has to be a center point of accountability. It's more of a question of to what extent core functions are maybe picked up more by those kind of core higher ed partner or industry partners. To your point though, our experience is the more densely you concentrate those functions, the faster you can move. And that's just a practical reality. But you'll hear that it doesn't always have to be that way, but it's certainly, again, the places that have been able to kind of get things up and moving faster tend to kind of house it and move the strategy forward.
Thank you.
Other final questions or reflections?
Brent, this is Laura Smith. I just wanted to make a comment on the, I think it was Clotilde that asked the question about clustering of industries as opposed to a company at a time, but groups of companies within. And we found in our approach that that grouping of companies works better for a whole host of reasons, especially efficiencies there. But I had a question about the Colorado model. When they began in an urban district as well as the Cherry Creek, a very wealthy part of Denver district. And is that something that you've seen in other parts that was necessary in order to get both the individuals and the employers, to people to know that this is different and the stigma around what could be an apprenticeship program? Or is that unique to Colorado?
It's not unique to Colorado. I think you'll hear from the Charleston Regional Apprenticeship Partnership. They purposely did Charleston County Public Schools, and they worked with 4 surrounding districts from more rural areas at the same time. So they worked with their lowest performing district in the state, as well as their highest performing district of the state. It is a feature of a lot of these startup efforts. I certainly think a big part of it, on one hand, is pushing back on the idea of who these programs are for and showing we can design these programs in a way that many different types of students can and must be successful in them. There's also an operational piece to that, which is if a program is designed with one district alone at once sometimes, then it becomes harder to work with more districts over time because you've kind of designed things towards the customs, the approach, and the culture within a particular district. So there is some value in that cross-pollination and from the get-go. That said, it's not always the case, but Colorado's not alone in going for that approach.
Brent, I'm just curious about the, I know it's so new, but about kind of the trends, once the individual is with an employer, I mean, what is the relationship? Obviously the employer is probably still part of that initial, setup of the program, but in terms of how the reporter relays the information about tracking in long-term.
Yeah. So a couple things on that. Number one, it's all about MOUs. These partnerships, the architecture of them are MOUs between districts, colleges, and these intermediary organizations that play roles that have to set very clear expectations about data use, privacy concerns. There's an architecture that's put into place to make the data flow. In terms of who does the tracking, it's an excellent question because it happens at 2 levels. One, intermediary organizations like CareerWise, and I want to be clear, everywhere they work, they don't work and start up new nonprofits anymore. They partner with now existing CBOs in communities to create those efficiencies. So whoever they're partnering with in their context, they're managing performance level data of where the students are, who's being recruited. It's administrative and from that sense, and they're tracking what happens to them. That's kind of level one, is that the organization that is serving as the intermediary has to create a situation where they know where students are across settings, and they need to be able to report outcomes. Then what you have though are how do you find who your apprentices are in your longitudinal data systems that are happening, so you can see which students are apprentices, where they're at in K-12, where they're at into their higher education journey, ultimately where they're at in the labor market. And that is a bigger systems and policy question that a lot of sites are wrestling with. because that actually is going to be really core to long-term sustainability. And it's one of the key state policy issues is if there's not a clear definition for what a youth apprentice is in the state, it's very hard to find the apprentices. They tend to be invisible in our state data systems. So there's both a performance administrative data level that's really held together by MOUs, and then there's broader work being done to more systemize the sort of tracking of where apprentices end up after their experience, which is one of the most important questions for this work going forward.
Just in the final minutes, there is intentional overlap between this group and the Youth Employment Coalition work that you are, Brent, that you and the Youth Employment Coalition work consultant, Nancy Martin and team are coordinating on. When the issue came up, or the question came up around opportunity youth, out of school youth, et cetera, I think that's where there's an opportunity to have intentional complementarity and alignment in strategies, youth apprenticeship being one very compelling strategy, but the other strategies, yet to be determined. But I also think the career pathways work, there is a great opportunity there to speak with one common language around the career pathways work, whether it's through an apprenticeship or not. So I think there's a huge need / opportunity in our community around defining market-driven, or however we decide to do it, career pathways that is complementary between these two synchronous efforts.
That's a great point, Clotilde. Couldn't agree more. And I think that's something we should certainly be deliberate about. I would even add one other point. Laura, you mentioned the work that the partnership is doing. Denver benefited, and CareerWise benefited from sector partnerships that already existed across employers who were already kind of engaging in this work about what are the occupations and career paths that we want to be promoted in our region. And because there's a foundation of that work in Western New York, that's certainly something that we should also look to align with and build from to the extent that makes sense. All right, I'm going to get us out of here on time. Let me go ahead and just make a few kind of announcements. So our next meeting is already scheduled, should be on your calendars, for October 27th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., same time window. When we've worked with communities in the past, we stretch things out sometimes so we can hear from a lot of different folks. What we're looking at, though, is to kind of get a lot of exposure as quick as we can. So what we might be doing is bringing in a couple different sites, and might even be breaking you out to kind of talk with some key folks from those sites to learn about them and kind of sharing with one another what you heard and what you learned and how it's relevant to the work. We are certainly in the discovery and learning phase. Key questions like coming out of today are, Livia put it right on the table. There could be a real way that we could create some efficiencies and partner with CareerWise and build off the stuff that's happening downstate in New York City to create efficiencies. But those are the types of questions we want this group to wrestle with. Our job is to bring in the information and share with you sort of what that experience has been, both through those types of partnerships as well as others. So we're in an expedited learning phase, but it certainly is still about the learning right now. And we want to make sure that on the November timeline, we can start having some serious kind of decision points around like, what is the right kind of approach for us to start to walk down. We will be continuing our interviews. We've had a few of them already with advisory committee members. If you haven't been reached out to get those scheduled already, it will be happening soon. It's an opportunity for our team to talk to you, to continue to get to know more about your work and what you're hearing and your interest in this process, so we can start to scaffold that design phase. So look out for that as well. One last announcement. If you just haven't had enough, PIA holds a summit each year where we bring in folks from all over the country to talk about youth apprenticeship, things that are happening in their communities. We do have one coming up. It'll be in mid-October. You all should be receiving the invitation to the virtual summit. If you haven't, it's a 3-day deal. Drop in when you can. We've got a great list of speakers and folks that'll be talking about youth apprenticeship and the work that they're doing that are part of the great PIA network. You'll see familiar faces like the ones today. You'll see a lot of other new ones. So I'm flagging that as an upcoming learning opportunity. And again, if you're a part of this and a part of sort of We have your email address. You'll be receiving an invite to it. Feel free to distribute it to whoever you want and your partners. It's an open public event that we host at New America. And as always, do not hesitate to reach out to myself or the team, both Molly Martin and Mike Preble. I want to thank them for also being a huge part of making the logistics of today happen, and be thought partners in sort of the trajectory of this work. So with that, unless there's any other final questions, Susan, Livia, you want to close us out?
No, I think that's great. Thanks everybody for hanging in here until 1:02. And I think we learned a lot today. I'm looking forward to the next meeting, and thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.